This is an episode we like to call You Ask Us. We've been digging around in our virtual mailbag and have brought a couple of your questions that you've sent in to discuss. And here's the first one, which came in via our online form, which you can find in the show notes if you want to ask your own question. Our listener asks, what are the political implications of the Cass report, and will it affect how British politicians approach the transgender conversation? So just to contextualise this, this refers to the review by paediatrician Dr Hilary Cass, commissioned by NHS England in 2020 after a sharp rise in the number of referrals to gender identity services. The review came out yesterday and exposed how children have been let down by a lack of evidence in medical interventions in gender care. Ahead of its publication, NHS England announced that puberty blockers, hormones to stop adolescent development, would no longer be routinely prescribed. And Hannah, you wrote the book Time to Think on the failures of the Tavistock Centre, which was the specialist NHS gender clinic that closed last week, 4 years after it was rated inadequate by inspectors. And our listeners can read your full analysis of the report's findings in your New Statesman piece, which is out online now, which I really recommend that they all read. But, we won't go through all of the report's findings now because they can go and have a look at your coverage. But our listener is most curious about the political implications of the review. So what have politicians, both in government and opposition, been saying about it so far?
Well, I think what's so striking is that the coverage has been across the political spectrum. Mm-hmm. So not on the front pages of every national newspaper, but on many, and that includes The Guardian, firmly on the left, through The Times, The Mail and The Telegraph. And it also led news bulletins across the BBC all day. And was, it was mainstream news, and they've all reported this lack of evidence base. Now, if you boil down what that's saying, it's really quite shocking, actually. It's saying that for the last decade and a half, the NHS has allowed the referral and the prescribing of puberty blockers to a group of really vulnerable children who are absolutely distressed, but without any real evidence that they're either clinically safe or effective. But I've been struck by that sort of broad coverage, really. And adding to that, we've had Wes Streeting come out for Labour saying we will absolutely make sure all of Dr Cass's recommendations are implemented. We're going to see this through. He actually said this has been a scandal in the health service. And Rishi Sunak also and other Conservative politicians have said the same. So I think for the first time, it's one of those really rare areas, isn't it, where we do have cross-party consensus that something has gone badly wrong and that both parties are absolutely committed to the same outcome. So I think that's quite incredible and extraordinary given how much heat there has been over this. And I'm encouraged by the fact that actually finally vast swathes of the British media and British politics are seeing this for what it is, which is a health story. It has always been a health story. It's never been critical of young gender questioning people or denying their trans identities or even saying people shouldn't transition. It's about whether the care provided to them is safe and effective and the best for them in each and every case. So that's really encouraging. In terms of what other impact it might have politically, I think it's absolutely going to have an impact on two really important areas of guidance/legislation. So firstly, we have this guidance for schools that's been put out to consultation about how schools deal with this issue, about whether teachers should both affirm their pupils in terms of new pronouns, way they present, what facilities they use. Do you allow those who are born male to use girls' toilets, for example? These are
this is social transitioning, which comes up in the review.
It does come up in the review. And what I like about the review is that Dr Cass rightly points out that the evidence base for all aspects of gender healthcare are weak, whether that's social transitioning, puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. And that means you can't say either way whether it's harmful or whether it's helpful. So there's just nothing there to go on. And so that's why we need more evidence, because the rule of medicine is first do no harm. So if there's no evidence of benefit, then you shouldn't do it until you have that evidence. With social transition, she said, we don't know either way whether it's not neutral, but we can't tell. The studies that exist there's not very many of them and they're not very good. and we can't tell either way whether it's beneficial or harmful. But she has drawn this quite important distinction between younger children who haven't hit puberty yet and older ones who have. And she said that it's likely, I guess, that those who are younger that socially transition is going to have the bigger psychological impact because parents have and adults have the greater influence in your life the younger you are. And so she's recommended that schools don't take that decision. She says that is actually a clinical decision, really, and she's recommending that younger children be seen very quickly by these new gender services. So I think that will feed into the school's guidance as it evolves when the consultation comes back. And then I think the second area is about conversion therapy. And this has been really thorny about whether gender identity is included in any ban on conversion therapy when you add that to sexuality. So that's about trying to change someone's sexual identity, or whether they're gay or bisexual or asexual or whatever, and whether you add gender identity to that. And that the thorniest thing has been about gender identity. Some would argue, if you can't even define something, how can you legislate for it? But the real fear has been that it would preclude, if you had sloppy legislation, it would preclude the very exploration that Dr. Cass is saying that these new gender services for children will have at the heart of them.
Because they'll have a holistic approach
rather
than just focus on gender.
So she's saying, medical transition probably will still be right, but for a very small number. And for the majority, it won't be. In fact, that will not be the right pathway for them. And so she's advocating, first approach, talking therapies essentially, and just exploring with a young person all aspects of their life, because one thing that she's confirmed, which we have known for a long time, is that many of the children contending with gender-related distress also have really some quite other significant difficulties in their life, maybe depression, anxiety, eating disorders. They might have suffered some trauma. So it's quite hard to see, I think, how any conversion therapy ban going forward I don't think it can ignore that. I'm finding it difficult to see how gender identity is included at all, really, because she has said you must have really strong safeguards against these accusations of conversion therapy. I think it's going to be so difficult to draft that I'm just not sure how you do that, really. But
Hannah, could I ask about what the NHS has said in response and what they're going to do? Because they're going to try and address the waiting lists, aren't they? And they're also going to try and expand the services. What are they doing there?
So we've got 2 new services that opened on the 1st of April, one in London and one in the northwest based out of Liverpool. A third one's opening in Bristol, hopefully sort of later this year, probably in the autumn. The idea is eventually to have 8, but those will not be the only thing. So what Cass is envisaging is a whole kind of network model where you have those are the kind of final destination, if you like, but not all children on the waiting list will need to go there. So there's kind of the idea is that you have some triaging, and certainly my understanding is at the moment that the children on the waiting list at the moment, of which there are 5,000 to 6,000, which is appalling, and they've been waiting for years without any access to any help whatsoever, which is disgraceful. But they are going to be seen by CAMHS, by Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, to kind of assess where they're at and what kind of level of help they need, because not everybody will, there are different levels of distress, there are different levels of need. So the idea is that to expand the skill set, because linking those 2 points between what you've asked, Freddie, about waiting lists and care and kind of the conversion therapy thing, is the main barrier at the moment, I guess, is getting the right professionals to be willing to work in this area of healthcare, because they're so frightened of A, accusations of conversion therapy, but B, of just not being covered and not having any guidance of what good care looks like. And what Hilary Cass has said is, look, you have the skills, like decent mental health professionals, those who work with children with neurodiversity, those who work in safeguarding, those who work in general mental health. You have those skills. That's what you do on an everyday basis. So please come and work here. And that's what she was saying, like, we need to just let them work, take the toxicity out. And so the idea is, if you have more people who already work in these related fields, that then you can expand care quickly. But I spoke to Dr. Cass on on publication of the report, and she said, she's under no illusions. This isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to take several years to roll it out. In terms of how NHS England have responded, I mean, pretty robustly, thankfully. And I guess, I think there's been no acknowledgement of how badly they've failed in the past, but they do seem to be committed to making things better. They've already demanded that the adult gender services, which rather shamefully refuse to hand over patient data to try and help add to the evidence base, that they must do that. They've said that they are going to urgently review adult gender care services as well, that they've asked them to pause any first appointments for those under 18, because you can go to adult services at 17 because of what Dr. Cass has said about the evidence base with hormones, about how we should proceed with extreme caution. So the mood music is, well, positive in terms of safety. I don't think there are many positives for all those young people waiting for care, and they've been very badly let down.
And when you mentioned CAMHS, it sort of rings a warning bell because it's so stretched.
It is so stretched. And that has been part of the problem in the past. I mean, many mistakes were of the Gender Identity Development Service, GIDS's own making, but not all of them, for sure. And one of the difficulties was that when a young person who had difficulties in their lives, including gender, appeared at CAMHS, as soon as they said the word gender, sometimes, understandably perhaps because of a lack of resources, they just palmed those children off onto GIDS. But that meant that all those other things were never dealt with, because they weren't dealt with at GIDS either. So, yes, it's going to be very difficult. I mean, NHS England seem to be committed to putting in the resource that's necessary. I don't know how that translates into CAMHS funding, but I think really it's a wider question, and it was Dr. Cass raised this quite considerably, that this isn't just about gender care, this is about actually a crisis in youth mental health services more broadly.
Yeah, and I think that's something Labour has picked up quite a bit, hasn't it, with its pledges to have mental health hubs in every community and every school as well.
Yeah, it has. I mean, just on Labour, I don't think we should be surprised about Wes Streeting's comments.
No, he's been on this for a long time.
A general shift on this topic for quite a while. We had back in, I think it was July last year, when Labour quite quietly dropped their commitment to introducing self-ID for trans people. And that was a sort of start, I think, in the move, both in terms of tone and language, but also in terms of policy. Wes Streeting this week has come out and said that he would no longer, or suggested that he would no longer say, trans women are women. So that there has been a huge shift, and I think that fits into the broader sort of rejection of what you could sort of categorise as social progressivism in Keir Starmer's Labour. I think they do see it as a risk, and they've tried to move both towards the government on transgender issues, but also on other social, racial politics and issues of social justice, because that's how many people see this issue. So I think that it fits into a broader. Maybe they shouldn't.
Well, I would take issue with that.
They like to describe themselves as socially conservative.
But people do see it in those terms. Maybe they shouldn't, but they certainly do. In terms
I think this issue that Cass has been addressing is very separate. I mean, obviously they're linked, but I think it is separate to trans women in women's prisons, self-ID, because, as I say, it's about children are actually not mini adults. They're children. And this is not about how you identify, because, of course, you respect people's identity. It's about whether you give drugs off-label that are potentially life-changing without a decent evidence base. And I think that is very different to talking about adults and the rights, a balance of rights. And I think it is perfectly compatible to have respect for trans people and to think nothing other than they deserve dignity and to live their lives free of harassment and access to good healthcare, but also think that the medical transitioning of children is a completely separate issue.
Yeah, completely, but that's not always how it's seen in politics.
Fair enough.
Yes, yeah. And we do need to move on to our next question. But just lastly, you mentioned Dr. Cass mentions the I think she calls it the exceptional toxicity of this subject in her review, and how actually that actually held professionals back from openly discussing their views about it, or even taking on young people who were coming to them with these issues as mental health patients or for autism screenings and things like that. But the toxicity has also played into the political debate as well. And I wonder if you think that this growing consensus that the Cass review has brought about, that you've just articulated to us, will stop politicians playing political football with the debate so much. I mean, we spoke about Rishi Sunak, telling Keir Starmer he can't define what a woman is at PMQs at every given chance. I mean, do you think that stuff will die down a bit now that there's a bit more of a mainstream sort of consensus?
I mean, I would hope so, but I mean, there are still Labour politicians completely dismissing Cass yesterday, which was pretty disappointing, and I can't see how they've actually read it. From the tweets, to me, don't imply that they've read it. But I mean, what do you think, Freddie?
I just to flip the question on its head, I think some people would rightly argue that it's not been a culture war the whole time.
Yes,
Just to say that the culture war might end, I think goes against the findings of the report, because the report suggests that this is a real issue that politicians have rightly raised over the years, and maybe it's those accusations that sometimes Labour hasn't taken it seriously have been justified. And I think Wes Streeting and the party leadership have moved their position, which makes it seem as if they accept that argument. So I don't think we can always constantly frame things in culture war terms, because whenever people say it's a culture war,
used as a political football.
I mean, it is, but so's everything. I mean, I don't think that should distract from the argument that there has been a genuine split on this issue for quite a few years
in both parties.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.